Now, at the Paris Climate Conference in 2015, international leaders promised to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. It was seen as a landmark agreement with 196 parties signing up. But that was almost 6 years ago now. And analysts today say that global emissions are in fact set to rise more than 15% by 2030, which would lead to a temperature rise of 2.7 degrees Celsius above those pre-industrial levels. So where does that leave us? Well, as the next major climate conference is being prepared, we're joined by specialists in environmental geopolitics and migration dynamics, a contributor to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, Mr. François Gemenne. Thanks so much for your time.
A pleasure. Good morning.
Good morning. I mean, let me just start with that. We've seen a summer of really extreme weather, and I know people say weather isn't climate change, but the trend we've been seeing is higher temperatures, more volatile climates. How bad do you think things are today?
Well, I think that we need to realize that what we used to consider as exceptional events are becoming the norm. And we used to look at the impacts of climate change as something that would only materialize far away in the future or in distant countries. And now we come to a point where we have to realize that this is happening right now, just before our eyes. So perhaps this will have a kind of shock effect as well on the commitments of government to tackle climate change. This is what German leaders said, and that hopefully it is a bit sad that we had to wait until these dramatic events happened in Europe for European leaders to realize that it was about time to tackle climate change more seriously. We'll see if that happens at COP26 later this year in Glasgow.
Is there time, though, to turn things around? When will we have gone past the point of no return, if you like?
Well, we passed that point in the 1950s or 60s. So what we need to realize is that we've already passed the point of no return, and that the change that we've inflicted to the climate is irreversible. So really what matters right now is how to govern and how to manage the irreversible and how to limit the damage as much as we can. But we need to realize that we've passed the point of no return, and that in our lifetime we will never get back to the climate we used to know some 20 or 30 years ago.
So are humans ultimately in danger, do you think, or am I exaggerating?
No, humans are ultimately in danger. Not all of them across the board, but certainly the most vulnerable communities are in danger. And clearly there are places on Earth that will soon become uninhabitable. Even if we were to stop all greenhouse gas emissions right now, the greenhouse gas that are in the atmosphere will not disappear in a snap of finger. We are now at plus 1.2 degrees Celsius. By 2035, whatever we do, we will be at 1.5 degrees Celsius of temperature increase, which was the objective set in the Paris Agreement. We still have a chance to limit this increase by 2 degrees by the end of this century, but that implies radical action right now. And what we've seen so far are promises and New Year's Eve's resolution that cannot replace real actual action.
Indeed, it does seem like these international conferences seem a lot of hot air at the end of the day. You know, we laud them as landmark, but then the actual action that follows. What needs to be done to give us this chance to limit it to 2 degrees Celsius? Is it up to the governments, because they have perhaps the most power to make the biggest changes? I'm thinking of planting of trees, ending deforestation, changing our energy consumption. Where does the solution lie?
All of that is useful, and there is not a kind of one-size-fits-all recipe. But I think what matters the most right now is to stop funding fossil fuel. Right now, if we look at the energy mix globally, this energy mix is still made up at 84% of fossil fuel. Every year, about 6% of the world's global GDP is sent back to the fossil fuel industry as public subsidy or private funding. As long as fossil fuels will remain so heavily funded, we will not be able to tackle climate change seriously. So money, funding, finance, this is really where I would, put the priority right now.
Of course, these are big lobby groups who seem to have quite a lot of sway on our authorities.
Of course, there are big lobby groups. We also need to realize that there are, millions of jobs represented by these sectors. We also need to realize that for developing countries that need to, pull out people out of poverty, these fossil fuels remain necessary, which is the reason why we need to invest heavily in renewable energies. As long as the energy mix will be so heavily made up of fossil fuel, we will not tackle climate change seriously.
And where are we when it comes to renewable energies? I mean, are we getting to the point to have enough to make this transition?
Well, the problem is that we don't make renewable energy available enough to poor countries. So when we focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, we have major technological breakthrough, but for us. And so basic technology remains unavailable to developing countries. I think this is a real challenge. This is the same for mobility. I mean, we discuss a lot about electric cars, but electric cars remain expensive and they will be used to reduce the carbon footprint of rich countries, while we will send our old cars to Africa or to Asia.
Even with things like these electric cars, there's a lot of questions over, over the whole lifespan of those cars. At the start when we recycled them, they weren't necessarily greener.
I'm just giving this as an example to show how much we focus on reducing our own emissions rather than reducing global emissions. And the climate doesn't care whether the emissions come from France, Botswana, or South Korea.
Now, you also study migration. Can you give us an idea of the people that are already, we've seen flavors of the climate change here in Europe or in the US, but people who are really forced to leave their homes already?
Climate change is already a major driver of migration and displacement worldwide. As a matter of fact, this is the leading driver of migration and displacement worldwide already, and we'll always speak of this in the future tense. Last year, in the year 2020, 30 million people were displaced as a result of disaster related to climate conditions. That is 3 times the number of people displaced by war and violence.
30 million, you said?
30 million, absolutely.
And from what regions in particular?
Mostly in Asia and sub-Saharan Africa.
So you would imagine that might get authorities to sit up. But again, we're coming up to Scotland, November, the next big international meeting. What are you thinking might happen?
Well, I'm hoping first that countries will upgrade their commitments. So far, the commitments are not enough, and there is a discrepancy between the global objective and the addition of individual objectives. And second, we need to find ways to make countries comply with their commitments. The real problem right now is that promises have replaced action and that countries do not comply with what they've promised. We need to find a way to make this compliant.
Okay, Mr. François.
There's just no other way around.
There is no other way around. Let's hope that world action will be taken very soon. But thanks so much for giving us an up-to-date idea of where things stand in the world. Mr. François Gemenne, thanks a lot.